Stephen Riley couldn't make it today, but Steve Lenart will be replacing him. Thank you. Sorry about that.
That's kind of right. Well, thank you, Lloyd. I'm sorry, Lloyd. It's the first thing that came to mind. So, in the program, this is a Cisco study update, and that may have left some of you wondering what I'm going to update you on, given that we haven't seen this framework of the study that Arunas did mention in his introduction. So maybe we could think of this more as a rollout and with some recent updates on progress. So I'll provide an overview today of a study that the Lake Huron Technical Committee had developed regarding an evaluation of really at its heart, it's a stocking evaluation of Cisco in west central Lake Huron. And so, let's see here. Okay, there we go. So what I'd like to cover today really is provide a little bit of background for you, and hopefully everyone can read the page there that I put out, that I copied from the proposal. I put it there just to remind folks that, if you're interested, certainly we could provide a full copy of the proposal. What I intend to do today is really go over the basic framework of the study, a little bit of background, some progress then since we presented this to the Lake Huron Committee in March of 2015, and some next steps. So in terms of the development of this study, really I don't think we can look at it, or we should look at this as something brand new. I think it's really should be viewed as a logical extension of some of the work that has been contemplated for years by the Lake Huron Committee, and I would say farther back. We mentioned the fish community objectives are more than 20 years old, but even so, Cisco, or lake herring back then, were recognized as a species worth restoring in the lake and restoring that ecological function. And so that fish community objective remains. Really, this is a long-standing unmet objective for Lake Huron. And so what the Lake Huron Technical Committee did is really kind of build on the work that was done in the mid-2000s and take that and craft a proposal which we would view more as a research evaluation. And so this proposal was presented to the Lake Huron Committee in March of 2015, and we did receive concurrence on the study objectives, and I note there a minor major caveat, which I'll talk about as we progress through here today. So in terms of what I'd like to do, and I'm going to apologize in advance, there's far more words on these slides than I typically like to have, but it's somewhat the nature of the beast if I'm going to provide the framework to you. The details, certainly, I won't cover every detail of the proposal, but really starting off with kind of the guiding principle behind this proposal really is that in order to learn, and simultaneously promote recovery of Cisco, is really we need to stock some fish. So that's really at the heart of where this is. But we can hopefully learn from information that has been gathered over the last decades. A lot of work has been done. And really build on that information and hopefully perhaps fill some knowledge gaps as it relates to Cisco restoration really across the Great Lakes. So in terms of a overall goal, really it's we characterize it as can we establish local stocks in an area of Lake Huron where Cisco were once a fundamental part of the fish community but are no longer present, not functionally so. So, and I am going to thank Ed Roseman for not making a fool out of me, because we did not consult on this map. So I'm going to talk about the current distribution of Cisco in Lake Huron and what we think we know about it. So Ed, I appreciate that our maps are going to align fairly well. So what we know is that we have, I guess you would characterize them as small but robust aggregates of Cisco throughout the North Channel. Lachino Islands, really along the North Shore, are probably where our most, I guess, abundant stocks or densities of Cisco are highest in Lake Huron. That's not to suggest that they're the only place that they're found, but we know there are recoveries also in Georgian Bay. And I'm not sure how much we know about spawning aggregates in Georgian Bay, but Cisco are captured there in surveys. And to a lesser extent, maybe along the northwest corner of the lake, we saw a couple blips, by Hammond Bay, and we've certainly had some rare recoveries down as far south as Alpena. But if you notice, that leaves a pretty darn big hole. And that's really kind of one of the fundamental reasons we thought that looking at a place like Saginaw Bay for an evaluation, stocking evaluation made a lot of sense. And so that's where this study is focused on, is Saginaw Bay. Saginaw Bay certainly once held one of the more productive Cisco populations in the lake. We know that the historic fisheries production was probably highest out of Saginaw Bay, and we think it's still habitat-wise a good place for Cregonine juveniles. So this is really kind of the primary goal is really to determine whether we can establish a local stock. And I think embedded in that is two hypotheses. Really, is that this lack of a local spawning stock is probably the fundamental impediment to recolonization. Now, do we know why we've not had any recolonization in that? Why don't we have any spawning stocks in Saginaw Bay? Well, those mechanisms, I think, remain unidentified. It certainly could have a behavioral component. We know that Saginaw Bay remains kind of spatially isolated from our existing populations of Cisco, or Saginaw Bay could be a pretty hostile place for a small, soft silver fish. All those things are certainly possible, but nonetheless, we think in terms of habitat, Saginaw Bay makes a lot of sense to do this work. The other thing in that you've heard mentioned over quite some period time, a series of these meetings, is we all know we have different Cisco morphotypes. So the question remains of whether those morphotypes actually, if there's a link between form and function. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and really what we're proposing or hypothesizing is that that's worth testing, and perhaps that there is indeed a relationship between form and function. So most of you have probably seen the next series of slides, and I gave credit to Wendy Stott for these. I don't know if that was the appropriate credit to be given. And somebody should think about royalties on this, because we've seen these slides quite a bit. So most of you are familiar now because you've probably been in the audience at these meetings. Look at, in terms of the historic Cisco forms across the Great Lakes, at least as described by Walter Kells. Is that that Ardidai form, the Ardidai was the dominant form really in all lakes except Lake Erie. So I added a little, what I'll call a friendly amendment with the red asterisk there, to just remind folks that in Lake Huron, although it's not the Albus form that was described, there is I guess another deep-bodied form that was described for the North Channel, that is the Manitoulin form. That form, by all accounts, still exists. So what we found really in looking at some of the work that Daniel et al. Had done in comparing these historic forms or contemporary forms to the historic forms is that really in Lake Huron, Lake Ontario, we've lost that Ardidai form. And that at least in Lake Superior, that Ardidai form remains, but we still have forms, discrete forms in certain places. I think Black Bay being one of them, where we see the albus type forms still extant. So in Lake Huron, what we see primarily is an albus type form. That's the predominant form in Lake Huron. Lake Michigan retains a form that is reminiscent of the Ardidai form, although it is a much smaller stock. So in terms of the really the robust stocks of this leaner Ardidai form, Lake Superior is obviously the place where they remain dominant. There's a question mark for Lake Erie and then also in Lake Ontario. So one of the things that I think I found pretty interesting, so I couldn't sleep last night, so I decided to roll out the Kells publication, start reading a little more closely and look at his areas where he sampled. I do find it interesting that we have this albus/Manitoulin form remaining in Lake Huron without any evidence presented from Kells observations, but I do also notice that there was no sampling conducted in the areas where we actually have these fish. Most of that sampling was conducted from Alpena south, at least as I read it. And if we encompass this distribution of dots with the circle, the only place that Kells would have actually observed fish would have been from the North Channel. So, I mean, I think that's an interesting aside. What it means is, I guess what I'm suggesting is, I don't know that we can exactly suggest that the albus form didn't exist in Lake Huron. So what we've done in our approach is really argue for doing an experiment in which we use both forms in a stocking evaluation. Both this kind of what we characterized as a nearshore or maybe a coastal form, one that is represented by most of Lake Huron populations, and they are deeper bodied fish, and then really an offshore or open water source, if you will. And I think in developing the proposal, the kind of natural progression would lead you to a Lake Superior source as the place to fill that Ardidai form. Now, so when we presented, here's where the caveat comes in. When we presented this to the committee, they approved the study, certainly in concept, and agreed to go ahead with a single form, a local form, Lake Huron form. Presumably as there was concern about bringing in genetics from Lake Superior. So what had happened at that point is there was some, I guess, analogous discussions happening at the Lake Michigan Planktivore Task Group and looking at restoration options for Lake Michigan, including for Cisco. And so they had kind of traveled down this path, and ultimately the Lake Huron Committee agreed to kind of wait for the results of some of the analysis that the Lake Michigan Planktivore Task Group had asked and convened a panel of geneticists to really look at this issue. So remains, I think, a fundamental part of the study is the two-form approach, and so that's what we'd still like to do. Be that as it may, we think that we were willing to move forward in a phased approach to allow us to start thinking about a local source for the study as well. So in terms of what about the numbers and where? So I mentioned this is really a focus on Saginaw Bay, and so what we propose is to stock equal numbers The sites that were identified in the proposal are Whitestone Point and Oak Point. We still need to, we think of those make sense. They're kind of outer bay-ish, right? So the fish may have some opportunity to escape predation by having closer access to deep water. And this is what we proposed is a 10-year study. So talking about fingerlings, I did some back of the envelope calculations. This is a stocking density total about 6 fish per hectare. If you went back and looked at what was proposed in the mid-2000s, far less, far fewer fish than what was proposed there. Nonetheless, it was, as is often the case, somewhat modeled out of our production capacity. And if you were to look at how this compares to some of the stockings in Europe of maybe analogous species, then it's far, far lower. That being said, I don't think it's an insignificant number of fish, right? It's still, I think, worth pursuing at these levels, and that's what we intend to do. Rearing space at the Jordan River National Fish Hatchery, and they've been kind of advancing along as the looking at the likely needs as we move forward on restoration activities or proposed restoration activities. So they've been contemplating this as well. So the objectives really that we've laid out, I think there's a fundamental objective is we have to learn how to do this on a production scale. Right? And so there's a lot, I think, still to be learned about rearing, marking, distribution practices. That being said, we have information to draw on. People are rearing and stocking artidae in the Great Lakes. Now, they're smaller scale stockings, right? Smaller hatcheries, smaller production. And so there's a lot of folks who have been working towards this, and there's been trips out to Europe to try to learn from those folks who have been doing this for many, many decades, albeit with a different species. But so there's a big knowledge gap that still has to be covered there. Now, if we can cross those thresholds, then what we would like to do is really compare survival and habitat preference of the two forms in Lake Huron, and really look at whether those stock fish return to stocking locations, suggest some level of maybe imprinting or homing. And then ultimately the idea is really to see if we can instigate a natural reproducing stock of Cisco in an area of Lake Huron where it's functionally extirpated. In terms of proposed schedule, it's a 10-year stocking study. I'm not going to go through in every detail, every row on this table here, but other than to suggest really the start of the proposal is going to be based primarily on when the Fish and Wildlife Service can reach critical mass in terms of its production capacity. I think they're cautiously optimistic. I'm looking for any of our hatchery personnel out there I'll duck if I need to, but they're cautiously optimistic that they can bring some gametes in this fall. I don't know that's a suggestion that we could have any production for 2017. I think it seems more likely that 2018 is, but we're all going to keep moving along on the presumption that we're going to be able to try to get fish into the system as soon as possible. In terms of evaluation, we think that we can rely pretty heavily on many of our existing surveys. We have the lake-wide crayfish surveys. You've seen the framework for those surveys. There's a pretty robust fish community survey structured in Saginaw Bay. Of course, fishery monitoring and predator diet analysis. On top of the existing surveys, we certainly would contemplate some new work. Those would involve primarily targeted fall spawning surveys, but also some early life history work. We've really begun actually through our office to start gathering some baseline information on the kind of the larval fish community in Saginaw Bay, and also some other early life history work that we've done as a result of some of our work with whitefish recruitment. So in addition to that, I put a bit of a question mark. Hydroacoustic surveys would be kind of a logical thing that we should consider for Saginaw Bay. If you notice the map, Saginaw Bay is not a place where large vessels go in for acoustic surveys. So there may be some capacity developed, hopefully, in which we could begin to bridge that gap. It's a very important, and it's not just about Cisco. We know the production in the bays is a pretty important. Those bays include, especially Saginaw Bay as it relates to the main basin and production of fish production, is an important place. So I think that would have multiple benefits. So we haven't worked on all the details as to how we would actually analyze any recaptures as part of this study if fish can survive. But what we have time to do that. And so that's really kind of where things stood as of March of 2015. And so in the ensuing year, I guess, we've made a little bit of additional progress. I put this map back up here of kind of the locations that we have some information. I'm not sure if I have okay. So let's see. So we have St. Mary's River, Drummond Island. Those areas. We actually have a pretty good time series of information on spawning aggregates there. We certainly have some recent information from the North Channel as part of a study that was done in cooperation with some commercial fishermen. And then I think there's a yellow dot there. It doesn't look very yellow to me up there, but it's the Lachino Island. So the Lachino Island. Well, before I step away from that, I guess I'll mention too. So these collections actually were included in the Yule et al. Morphometric work. So we know something about those populations in that regard. And Wendy, you can correct me if I'm wrong. We certainly have genetic information from the Drummond Island and St. Mary's River. And do we have North Channel? Not yet. Okay. Not yet. So what we've done is we've added. So this was really an idea that we needed to. There was a bit of a knowledge gap for the committee, so we commenced on a pilot study in the Lachino Islands to look at that location as a potential donor source. And we looked at seeing if we could evaluate really kind of the spatial and temporal characteristics of Cisco spawning in the Lachino Islands as the primary objective. And there's a little bit of a map there on the inset that shows the Lachino Islands, kind of a blow-up of what that habitat looks like there. So beyond that, we also were interested in seeing if we could collect gametes for pilot fertilization work, but also collect fish for fish health evaluations, and then some of the ancillary collection that I mentioned, including genetics, morphometrics, meristics, and some other things that we were interested in. So we embarked on that in the fall of 2015, and we were successful in identifying multiple spawning aggregates in the islands. So we were able to get good information on maturation, size and age structure, and fecundity as well. Much like the other locations or other populations in Lake Huron as they exist, these fish seem to be oriented towards rocky habitat in terms of the actual spawning activities. So we were able to collect fertilized gametes and ship some to the Science Center and their new wet lab facility, as well as send some up to LSSU in Lake Superior State for some fertilization trials. And I was talking to Wendy last night, and we had 17 families, and unless something's changed between last night and tonight, we have still 16 of those representatives from 16 of those families. Okay, good. So, so we were able to do that. We did collect fish for fish health examination or evaluation in both Drummond Island and LCI. Renibacter was detected in both populations. I don't know that that was a big surprise to our fish health folks, but it certainly is a management issue that we have to think about moving forward. Okay, so, one more slide. So really kind of we wanted to compare what we know about some of our other populations in Lake Huron and see where the Lachino Island populations stack up. So this is actually a slide I borrowed from Mark Ebner, who presented this, I think, last year. And where I just overlaid on the two graphs in which we actually have time series of spawning fish. So the top right and bottom left is bottom left would be the Drummond Island Refuge, top right St. Mary's River surveys, and just a quick and dirty comparison of densities that we saw in the LCI in 2015 relative to some of those other populations. So certainly on par with what we've seen there. And I guess we conclude that in terms of feasibility, I think the LCI should be adequate to meet the gamete needs for Lake Huron source. And there's some other advantages to the Lachino Islands as well. So next steps, we want to complete the analysis of morphometrics, meristics, and genetics for the 2015 Lake Huron collections. Just as on a cursory note, there is appears to be some diversity of forms even within the Lachino Islands, but most of those forms do seem to align more with the albus type forms, and more to come on that. Genetic analysis, the Lachino Island and North Channel samples. Arunas mentioned an operational plan to support this study. So that's something that we contemplate here doing within the next, really within this calendar year. So we have the framework, but there's a lot of details still to be ironed out. And we would hope that this year we can come up with the final recommendation on source populations that would be acceptable to the Lake Huron Committee to fully implement the study as designed. And in a final note, we have to finish building the hatchery space too. So there's a lot that has to happen between now and then. Our hatchery folks are probably thinking they're probably going to kill me, but so we've been moving on along the lines, and we'll continue to do so. So that's all I had. Thank you.